Hi, fifth graders. Today we will be reading chapter 15 of Pillage by Obert Sky. So remember in chapter 14, he got to talk to his uncle again, and he still didn't really understand anything he said, but he felt good about talking to his uncle. He thinks his uncle's crazy because he's been up there forever, and remember, he's going to the bathroom in a pot. Ooh, gross. So we are going to start chapter 15. Excerpt from section 7 of The Green Got Not as recorded by Daniel Phillips. The first dragon grew to full size in a matter of weeks. Bruno fed it the weeds that his gift had helped him grow. The dragon never wandered far from the nest where it had been born. Eventually, Bruno chopped the nest apart and the dragon flew off across the Irish Sea. Without instruction, the beast raided a small village in Scotland. By the end of the night, everything the town had of value was in Bruno's possession. Sorry guys, my dog's having a hard time. Chapter 15, Me with a Thorn in My Side. Yes, Mr. Phillips, Mr. Squall said dryly. What is it? I don't understand, I said honestly, wanting to make sense of what I thought he was saying. The dragon represented what? I had learned years ago that despite what so many adults always said, there really was such thing as stupid questions. I had asked a number of them myself over the course of my life, but I had also learned that life required asking stupid questions every now and then. Squall sighed. It had been more than a week since the last snowfall, and with the temperature rising quickly, the snow was starting to melt. There were more patches of green and brown on the ground than white. We had missed almost a week of school, and Mr. Squall was determined to cram down our throats everything the snowstorm had delayed. Who said anything about dragons? Squall questioned. I looked at the book in my hands. I mean, demons? I said, slightly embarrassed that my thoughts were on dragons. What's not to understand, Beck? He asked tiredly. The character believed that he could be both physical and immortal. He was a demon who aspired for more. I rolled my eyes for all to see. Come down here, Mr. Squall insisted, motioning for me to approach. Now. I shrugged and stood. I closed my book and walked to the front of the class. I know out west there is a sloppy casualness, he said, waving his hands. Here, however, rolling your eyes is a form of poor upbringing. The class laughed lightly. Perhaps you would like to stand here and roll your eyes for the class? Not really, I said. It's not a request, Squall said. I rolled my eyes, exaggerating the motion. Again, Squall insisted, folding his arms smugly across his chest. The class was laughing louder. Squall tapped his pointing stick on his desk as if he were conducting the laughter. I rolled my eyes and added a smirk. The class liked that. Mr. Squall held his palms up to try and quiet everyone. Unfortunately, my poor upbringing kicked in. I rolled my eyes, smirked, and bowed. Enough, Squall said, realizing he was losing control of the class. I rolled my eyes in his direction. Mr. Squall grabbed me by the collar of my oversized sports jacket and spun me around to look into my eyes. He leaned close and whispered into my ear. Did Aaron send you to humiliate me? He hissed. Does he want to ruin my life twice? Mr. Squall pushed me away. Sit down. He turned away to write something on the chalkboard. I went back to my seat, thinking hard about what Mr. Squall had said. At lunch, Milo and I talked about finally returning to the conservatory. Kate was eating lunch with the popular kids, but I knew she would come along if I invited. Wyatt passed our table with Ellis and Carl in tow. Ellis made a face, but they knew better than to mess with me, especially when the school was serving coleslaw. What about Scott? Milo asked. It's Thursday, Miley said. He's taking the horse to the vet. Our conversation was halted by the shadow of Mr. Squall. He stood hovering over me with Principal Wells next to him. "Now," was all that Wells said, jerking his head toward the cafeteria door. I stood up and asked Milo to take care of my tray for me. "Your office?" I asked the principal. "Now." After I stepped in his office, Wells closed the door. Mr. Squall leaned against the back wall, and Principal Wells took his seat behind the desk. "Professor Squall tells me you have been disrupting his class. I want to know why, Beck." He said my name as if he had taken a class that told him how to do so. "What is bothering you?" he asked. I decided to be honest. "Dragons." Principal Wells jumped in his seat. "Don't be tart," Squall said to me. He turned to Principal Wells. "See what I mean?" I looked back and forth between him and the principal. They were communicating with each other by huffing and puffing. I laughed. I couldn't help it. "What?" Principal Wells demanded. "Do you find all of this amusing? There's a responsibility necessary to learning at Colobrar." "I'm horrible with responsibility," I admitted. "My mother wouldn't even let me have a pet fish." "Don't bring your mother into this," Squall said hotly. "I could pretend it was someone else who wouldn't let me have a fish if you'd like," I said angrily. Now, Principal Wells said, trying to keep the conversation under control. "No need to get heated up. We just want to know how we can help." "Then I'm not in trouble?" I asked impatiently, not wanting to be late for my next class and risk being called into the principal's office yet again. "Well, that depends," Wells said. "On what?" "Listen," Principal Wells said, "I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot the other day. The Phillips name still holds water in King's Plot, and we aren't looking to punish you. We have the weighty responsibility of watching over you. We just want to make sure you're not getting yourself into trouble." Principal Wells' big round face looked even more absurd when he was speaking nonsense. "He's not ready for my class," Squall protested. "Not ready for English Lit?" I laughed. "See," Squall said, sounding like a baby. "Quiet, Simon," Principal Wells said, holding up his hands. "Listen, Beck, the important thing is that we put away foolish thoughts. Take responsibility for our actions. We can't just roll our eyes and start fights and make up silly stories about dragons." "I didn't make up a story," I pointed out. "Yes," Principal Wells said, relieved. "See, I'm glad you understand. No stories about dragons. There have been rumors in the past of your family and, well, no more stories. Now, off to class." I stood up and left, having no idea how the world operated when people in control were adults. When I got home from school, Miley fed me a huge cinnamon roll. It was probably the second or third most delicious thing I had ever eaten. I then put on my snow boots and announced loud enough for everyone to hear that I was going sledding by myself down the road. "There's not much snow left," Thomas said. He was right, of course. The weather had warmed up and the snow had melted fast. All the rivers on the mountains were rushing like wet, out-of-control trains. "I'll find enough to sled down." Miley looked at Thomas, and I could see him remember something. "Stay where you belong," he said, glancing back at Miley. His instructions sounded rehearsed. I walked out of the manor and along the side of the drive, halfway down the path. I turned and trudged through the woods to the meeting spot. When I got to the willow, nobody was there. I was surprised at how excited I felt. I couldn't wait to get back into the conservatory and see what had happened to the stones. Milo and Kate were 5 minutes late. "Again?" Kate said. "Milo's a slow walker. You're sure that gardener's gone?" "Positive," I said. "Everyone else is in the kitchen." There was even less snow than I had thought. Of course, there was way more mud than I had anticipated. Milo got stuck twice, and Kate almost lost one of her shoes. By the time we got to the conservatory, all three of us had high water mud marks up to our knees. There was a large pile of snow on the ground next to the bricked archway behind the conservatory. I couldn't see the ivy on the ground, but All I had to do was think about it, and bright green vines shot upward, grabbing onto the bricks like drowning victims reaching for a rope. The ivy climbed the wall quickly, grateful to be able to stretch. Wow, Milo said. Ready? I asked. They both nodded. Kate went first, followed by Milo, and then me. The ivy was so easy to climb, I wondered why there were no ivy ladders or ivy nets in the world. I figured it was just another thing that adults were missing out on. All three of us sat on top of the wall in a cloud of mist, pausing to catch our breaths. Geronimo, I said, swinging out and climbing down the inside ivy. I landed on the snowy ground and watched to make sure Milo and Kate were coming. Kate spotted the change in the garden before she was even off the ivy and swore in exclamation. I turned to see what had made her swear. The shack was half burned. The metal bins were filled with melted snow and water, and a thin crust of ice skimmed across the top. Where the little plants had been, though, there were now 8 gigantic leafy pods. They looked like they were 12 feet in diameter. A couple of the pods shivered as we gazed dumbfounded at the sight. Each pod had a small round hole on top, and as if the sight of the huge plants wasn't unnerving enough, each pod was floating 2 or 3 feet above their green nest. Thick, bushy weeds blanketed the conservatory grounds. What happened? Milo asked. It seemed pretty clear to me. The nests grew. And learned how to float? Kate added. I walked over to the closest nest. I reached out to touch it, but changed my mind because it was shivering like a wet dog. Kate walked over to one and touched it despite the shivering. It's warm, she whispered. Is the stone still inside? Milo asked, clinging to the ivy, ready to climb away if things went bad. I stared at Milo, dumbfounded. I can make things grow, but I don't have X-ray vision. I stared hard at the nest just to make sure. Milo kept his hands on the ivy. Nothing's going to happen, I assured him. It's perfectly... My assurance of safety was cut short by the sound of one of the nests beginning to howl. The low, haunting noise gave me greater goosebumps than the cold wind. Milo was halfway back up the ivy on his way out. The howling nest trembled and fell down against the ground. The drop shook the ground we were standing on and caused all the other pods to wobble and fall. Kate fell against me, making me lose my balance. Milo was still up on the ivy, clinging for dear life. Once the nest settled, they began to whistle and howl through the holes on top. Maybe we should go, Kate said, concerned. I wasn't going to argue with her, but I knew if I climbed out, I would eventually have to climb in to see what had happened. Hold on, I said. We can't just leave. Don't you want to know what they are? Okay, Kate agreed. How about if Milo and I leave and you tell us about it later? Really? I asked, surprised. I thought you were much braver than that. Personally, I was scared to death, and the last thing I wanted was to be left alone in the conservatory. I figured if I bullied Kate into staying, I would be better off. Kate growled. Surprisingly, she still looked pretty. They're not going to hurt us, I said. How do you know? Milo yelled down from the ivy. They're plants. Floating, howling plants, Kate said, trying to sound brave. Where are the stones? I'm going to guess inside of those things, I said nervously. I felt like an idiot. I was shaking in fear because of a big plant. There had been times in my past when I had to go out at 1 o'clock in the morning and find my mother hiding on the street. It was not unusual for her to disappear and hide behind a business or a home somewhere. I always knew that if I reported her behavior, I would become a ward of the state, or even shipped off to some crazy relative who owned a strange, gigantic manor where plants had personalities. This is stupid, I said. They're just plants. I walked right up to the nearest nest and knelt down. I leaned over and put my arms around the leaves. The nest was so warm, and I could hear faint purring. Stick your hand in the hole, Milo called down. I ignored him, concentrating on the nest in front of me. The hole breathed, a trace amount of air escaped. I looked at Kate and decided to pretend I was much braver than I actually was. I carefully stuck my hand in the hole. The nest was hot and moist inside, and as I lowered my fingers, I could feel thick, sticky goo. That was enough for me. I pulled my hand out quickly. There was a thick orange snot-looking blob hanging from my fingers. We all collectively ewed. I tried to fling the orange stuff off my hand, but it was unflingable. Even worse, it was creeping down the rest of my hand and moving along my arm. I'm man enough to know when to scream. What can I do? Kate screamed back. Pull it off. Kate looked at the slowly spreading goo. No way. It was not the answer I was expecting. Here, I had dreamed of having a future together with Kate, and she wasn't even girl enough to extract a snotty substance off my arm to save my life and open the possibility of us even having a future? While I was lamenting, Kate picked up a stick and poked at the orange blob. Apparently, she did care. The orange goop moved onto the stick. I took the stick and shoved the goo back into the pod's hole. Okay, I said, now we'll go. Before I could even turn around, though, the pod I had just poked began to crackle and slowly open. The movement and noise were strangely mesmerizing. The leaves folded back and wriggled open, exposing a large, gooey center. In the middle of the goo was one of the stones. It was glowing. As if on cue, all the other nests began to sizzle and open, distracting me. The sound was frightening. Come on, Milo yelled down. Let's get out of here. Kate and I ran to the ivy. Like a gentleman, I let Kate go first and then scrambled up after her. A loud pop sounded behind me. I lost my grip on the ivy and fell back down into the dirt. I jumped up and looked around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me with a smoking gun. There was no gun or smoke in sight, but all the nests were spread open, and the enlarged stone in the first nest was cracked. There was another pop, followed by a bang, and two more firecracker-like explosions. They're all opening, Kate yelled down from her spot on the ivy. Come on! I leapt back onto the wall, pulling myself up as fast as I could. It sounded like a battlefield behind me as the report of bursting stones filled the air. Milo had made it to the top of the wall and was already climbing down the outside. I watched Kate push through the cloud of mist and up over the wall as well. Wait, I yelled. Kate, hold on. All I could see was Kate's face through the mist, and as she peered back over at me. She looked appropriately worried. What? She yelled. Hurry! We can't just leave, I said. What are they? You're welcome to go back and look, Kate said, scared. I glanced down, trying to see through the mist. Kate saw my hesitation and panicked. You can't go down, Beck, she said. I was joking. Come on. I started to move away from her. Beck, don't! I smiled and slipped below the cloud of mist out of her view. I didn't feel quite so brave without her watching me. The popping and cracking stopped, but the sound of something tittering and chippering could be heard. I looked over my shoulder as I climbed down the ivy, but I couldn't make out what was making the noise. It looked like something in each of these nests was squirming. When my feet hit the ground, I turned to take a good look at what was happening. My mouth dropped open wide enough to house a full-grown chicken. In the center of every nest was a small, wriggling creature. I rubbed my eyes with my hand and took a better look. Uh-oh, I whispered. The small creatures in each nest squeaked and stretched. They were all different colors and slightly different sizes. Most had large, wide-set blue eyes with protruding noses and big mouths. Some were uglier than others. A couple of them were even cute. I couldn't believe my eyes. I had grown up watching plenty of movies and TV shows with realistic special effects. I had even seen dinosaurs roaming and witches flying, all thanks to the magic of computer animation. Those things had appeared real, but I could tell that what I was seeing now was no special effect. It was real. Amazing, Kate said right behind me, startling me. I knew there was no way you could stay away. I smiled nervously. I could see Milo coming back down the wall. He slowly let go of the ivy, looking fearfully at what was happening. What are they? He asked. I think they're dragons, I answered honestly, half wishing they were only special effects. I walked up to one of the nests and looked down at the creature. Pick it up, Kate whispered. Apparently, I'm influenced by girls whispering things to me. I reached out and lifted the small creature. It was green and folded like an accordion in my hands. It was cute, but I could see misunderstanding and fire in its eyes. I shifted him to Kate's outstretched hands. She cradled it like a baby and whispered something to it. I felt betrayed. It's beautiful, she said. I don't believe it. I stared. The evidence is pretty convincing, Kate smiled. Milo wanted to just look at the creature and not touch it yet. Kate handed me the dragon and I lifted it up to stare in its eyes. As I did so, it scratched my chin with its sharp black claws. Ow, I said, quickly putting it back in the nest. We all stood back, gazing at the baby dragon stretching and coming to life. Unbelievable, I said in awe, rubbing my scratch. Are you okay? Kate asked. I realized I honestly didn't know how to answer her. Hey, my friends, that is the end of chapter 15. I will see you tomorrow for chapter 16.